Okay, welcome everyone. Tonight we are going to do two chapters. For those who have the book, chapters 53 and 54. We are continuing with our section on numbers. And today we're going to do a very important idea of how many letters or words are there in a verse, in a passage, in a book. And we divide it into two chapters, just to make it easier. And this is part of the mathematical code of the Torah. A scribe is called a sofer, which is a bit surprising because the word sofer means a counter. You would think someone who's writing a Sefer Torah would be called a writer, an inscriber, but he's called a sofer. And that is because in the old days, a sofer knew all the traditions about the numerical and the mathematical code throughout the Torah. How many letters in a verse? How many letters in a parsha? How many letters in a book? What's the middle letter? How many words in a verse, in a passage, in a parsha, in a book, in the whole Chumash? These were important ideas. The Baal HaTurim especially comments on this all the time. And for those who have been following this series, we quote the Baal HaTurim all the time because he had an unbroken tradition of the different numerical values of not just the words, but how many letters, how many words. And this is a very, very important part of our tradition. So we're going to start, for those who have the book, on page 522. And the first couple examples are actually going to be the first and second verses of the Torah. So we'll start with the second verse of the Torah, and that is in Hebrew, V'ha'aretz hayta tohu v'vohu, v'choshech al pnei ha'tahom, v'ruach Elokim merachefet al pnei hamayim. And the earth was chaotic and void, empty, and darkness was on the face of the abyss, and the Spirit of God moved or hovered above the waters. So this, I believe we've dealt with this pasuk for different reasons. In this context, there's four descriptions here: tohu v'vohu, choshech, and pnei hatahom. Chaotic and empty, darkness, and the deep of the abyss, the face of the abyss. So in the Midrash Rabbah, it says that these four descriptions are indicative, are prophetic of the four exiles that the Jewish people would endure. Tohu, chaos, is Babylonia. Vohu, empty, is Persia. Darkness, choshech, is Greece. And the abyss is Rome. And the abyss being Rome, because the image, or even the definition of an abyss, is almost like an endless fall, an endless pit. And 2,000 years later, we're still considered in the last exile of Rome, even though we're back in Eretz Yisrael, and we have 1 foot in redemption, but we don't have 2 feet in redemption. We only have 1 foot. And therefore, we are still experiencing this last tahom, this abyss of the last exile of Rome. So here's an example where you have 4 descriptions in one verse, and the Midrash sees this as prophetic. the Midrash continues, what is the Spirit of God moving across the waters? The Spirit of God, according to the Midrash, is the Spirit of Mashiach. And so therefore, in the second verse of the Torah, in a sense, we have in a nutshell how all of history would unfold. We have the 4 exiles, and then it will end with the coming of Mashiach. So this is quite an amazing prophetic aspect of the Torah that is encoded right in the second verse of the Torah. Our next example is the first passage, the first day of creation. In the first passage of the day of creation, the word light appears 5 times. The first 2 are when it says, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. Vayomer Elokim yihi or, vayihi or. But in the first day, the word light appears 3 more times, a total of 5 appearances of the word light. And so the commentaries connect the 5 appearances of light to the 5 books of the Torah, because the Torah is called Oraita in Aramaic. It is, in a sense, a book of light. And also in the Chumash, the Torah is compared to light, Torah or. In fact, there are many yeshivot called Torah or. One is in Jerusalem. So the idea that the Torah is light. Other commentaries point out that the 5 appearances of the word light is connected to the 5 levels of the soul. Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, and Yechida. And we know that the soul is connected to light because of the verse, Ner Hashem Nishmat Adam. The candle of God is the soul of a human being. So here's a deep connection between light and soul. The light is soul. So here we have the 5 books of Chumash and the 5 levels of soul connected to the 5 appearances of the word light on the first day of creation. So here's 2 examples right in the beginning of the Torah. And later, I'm going to add it now. This is actually in chapter 54, but we'll add it now that in the first verse of the Torah, the sages point out that the letter Aleph appears 6 times. In the first verse, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The letter Aleph appears 6 times. So one may ask, okay, so what does that mean? So the sages explain that the letter Aleph has a name. Aleph has many different meanings. And one of the meanings is Eleph. Eleph means 1,000. So the sages say the fact that there's 6 Alephs in the first verse of the Torah is hinting to us that this cycle of creation, of history, will last 6,000 years, followed by the 7,000th year, which is Shabbat. So just like we work 6 days and we rest on the 7th day, or we work the land 6 years and then we rest on the 7th year. So in the bigger cycle, the bigger historical cycle, so we will have 6,000 years of, we'll call it normative history, which will be followed by the 7,000th year of Mashiach, the 7th millennium. So here, right in the first two verses of the Torah, we have many examples of how the sages, later Kabbalists, commentaries, Hasidic rabbis, they looked at every verse and they counted the letters, they counted the words, and they saw tremendous significance in this. This is a very, very important part of our tradition. The next one we're going to do is on page 525. And this is a passage in the Torah that I'm sure we have discussed before. And that is in the Parsha of Vayishlach, at the end of the portion. So there is a long account of the lineage of Esav. And after that, the Chumash kind of switches gears, and it's more about Am Yisrael. But here it finishes a long explanation of the exact names and the children of all of the different children that came from Esav. And towards the end, there is what's called the 8 kings that ruled in Edom before there was a king in Israel. And it goes and it mentions that this king ruled and he died. And then this king ruled and he died. And this king ruled and he died. We are going to be, again, this is another invitation, that this Tuesday, we're going to begin a new mini-series that I thought was fitting for the 3 weeks, learning about Olam HaTohu and Olam HaTikun and Shvirat HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels. So the Zohar and the Ari HaKodesh, they saw in this passage about these 8 kings the encoded mystery and wisdom of previous worlds and the phenomenon, the event called the breaking of the vessels. I'm not going to go into that right now, but I'm bringing this up for a different reason, is because different commentaries mention why were there 8 kings? What's the significance of 8 kings? And so one of the reasons given is when Yaakov meets Esav after 20 years. When Yaakov ran away from Esav, Esav wanted to kill him. And they were separated for 20 years. And now Yaakov is coming back to Eretz Yisrael. Esav is coming with 400 men. The night before, Yaakov fights with the angel. And according to Rashi, it's the angel of Esav, and he defeats him. And the next day, Yaakov and Esav actually meet. And at the meeting, it's pointed out that Yaakov addresses Esav 8 times, saying, "My Lord." In other words, he took a very, very humble position towards Esav, even though the night before he had actually defeated the angel, the guiding angel of Esav. And yet, he took a somewhat passive position vis-a-vis Esav. And he said, "My Lord," 8 times. So some of the commentaries say, why were there 8 kings who ruled in Edom before there was a king in Israel? Is because Yaakov said, "My Lord," 8 times. So here's just another example where a number which we might not think has any significance or is important, we find that there's a whole tradition behind it. And that is, as we said, the 8 appearances of Yaakov saying, "My Lord," to Esav. Now, the next example we're going to do is on page 526. And that is, we're going to do 2 examples in a row, both about incense. The first example is that one of the ingredients of the incense was frankincense. Frankincense is described 2 times in the Torah, once in the book of Shemot and once in the book of Vayikra, of having to be pure. The frankincense had to be pure. And so the Baal HaTurim points out that the only other place that this word pure in this way, usually the word for pure is tahor or tahara, but here it's zacha. So it has to be pure. The only other time this word appears is in the book of Job, where Job is talking about prayer being pure. And so it's like connecting the dots that the Baal HaTurim says. So what do we learn from this? What do we learn from these 3 appearances of the word of Zacha in the whole Tanakh? But 2 of them have to do with the Ketoret, the incense, and 1 has to do with prayer. So he says it's very simply, just like the Ketoret, the incense had to be these pure herbs, so too our prayer has to be pure. And just like incense, like a candle, it goes up, the smoke of the incense rises up. Well, so too should the intent of our prayers be elevated and rising to Hashem above. So this is a very simple idea, but again, we learn it from, well, how many times does the word Zacha appear in the Tanakh altogether? The next example is really a very, very awesome one, but it also has to do with incense. And here, it's a very similar word. Instead of the incense or prayer having to be pure, they used to grind the incense very, very fine. And the word used in the Torah for this very fine grinding is dakah. They would grind it dakah until it was very, very fine. And so this word only appears one other time. The Baal HaTurim was a master. Since he knew the whole Tanakh, he would know that this word appears in these 4 places or these 6 places. And then he would make connections. He would make amazing connections between every time a word appears in the Tanakh or in a certain book. Or we all already learned how many times does the word light appear on the first day of creation. So this is a method. That's why it's in this book, 70 Faces, because this is a method that the sages and commentaries have used for millennium to extract the inner dimensions of the Torah. So where does the other time that the word dakah, fine, come in? So this is the whole story of Elijah the prophet. Eliyahu Hanavi, he is, in this story, the king Achav and the queen Isabel want to kill him. And he's the last of the prophets. And he escapes and he goes to Har Sinai. And at Har Sinai, he's in a cave. And God comes and asks him, "What are you doing here?" And Elijah says, "I'm escaping for my life. The people have abrogated your covenant. Everyone's worshiping the idols. And I'm like the only one left." And Elijah's in a cave. And he heard God's voice. And then a great wind comes. And so Elijah thought God is in the wind. but the wind stopped, and in the book of Malachim, this is in the book of Malachim, the 19th chapter, the whole story says God was not in the wind. And then the earth shook like an earthquake. And Elijah was sure God was appearing to him, and that's why there was an earthquake. But it stopped. And it says God was not in the earthquake. Then there was fire. Elijah experienced fire, like at Har Sinai. But God was not in the fire. And then it says that Elijah heard kol demama daka. This word daka, a thin, silent voice. And this is the source of the famous song, "The Sound of Silence," Simon and Garfunkel. This is the original source of the concept of the paradoxical sound of silence. Because if it's silent, then you have no sound. And if there's a sound, there's no silence. But this is what Elijah heard. And then God spoke to him. He knew that God was in the kol demama daka. So now you have this word daka by the incense and by this silent, thin. The word thin is even hard to use because it's really a silent voice. It's so thin that there's no voice. So what's the connection? So the connection is that on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol would go into the Holy of Holies with incense until the whole room would fill with smoke. And he would say a short prayer. And it was a once a year event. Today, we do not have a temple. We don't have a tabernacle. We don't have a Kohen Gadol. We don't have a high priest. But we do have prayer, and our prayers have replaced the service in the temple. And so every Yom Kippur in Musaf, in the additional prayer, we actually follow the high priest as he goes through the service in the temple. And the climatic point of the service is when he goes into the Holy of Holies with the incense. So he goes in with the incense, which is ground very fine. And here's where the word comes in. The vort is that when the Kohen Gadol would go in to the Holy of Holies, well, what did he experience? So while the room was filling with incense, he could experience the kol demama daka, the silent voice of God speaking to him. And why that's important is because today, when we do the service of Yom Kippur through our prayers, it's as if we are the Kohen Gadol. And so we can still experience in the height of prayer, and it doesn't have to be on Yom Kippur, but there's no doubt that Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are auspicious times to reach a connection with God, which is not always so available. And so here we see that the incense being fine and the silent voice being described as being a fine, silent voice is something that we could really meditate on. It's a very, very deep meditation that each person can do. But certainly during Musaf of Yom Kippur, we have this opportunity, as it were, to go into the Holy of Holies and hear the kol demama daka. So this is a very, very awesome idea. The next one we'll do is on page 529. This is a short one, but it's very connected to the very first one we did. If you remember, the first one we did is where the 4 exiles of the Jewish people were hinted to in the second verse of the Torah, in the words chaotic and empty, darkness and the abyss. That the Midrash saw this as indicating the 4 exiles. So in Shir HaShirim, in the Song of Songs, in the first verse of the 7th chapter, it says, Shuvi, Shuvi Hashulamit, Shuvi, Shuvi. Now, this is extremely unusual that you'd have a word repeated 4 times among 5 words. Shuvi, Shuvi Hashulamit, Shuvi, Shuvi. And so one of the commentaries is why all this repetition is, again, it is an allusion to the 4 exiles that we would experience, but each time there's a return. Just like Jacob went down to Egypt, but he returned. And we went down to Babylonia and Persia, and we returned. And we were sent out after the second temple, the Roman Edom exile, and now we've returned. Shuvi, Shuvi, Hashulamit, Shuvi, Shuvi. And the word Shuvi is the root of the word tshuva. And all of the Chazal in the book of Deuteronomy, Devarim, connects our return to Eretz Yisrael with tshuva. So Shuvi, Shuvi is not just return, but it's dependent on, it's based on, even though there's a famous machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, is the final redemption tied to doing tshuva? And ultimately the answer is yes. Maimonides says it very, very clearly. There's a whole question though, well, how will the tshuva happen? Will it happen naturally? Will it be forced on us? But it's agreed that part of the redemptive energy that needs to happen to bring the full redemption is our tshuva. So Shuvi, Shuvi, Hashulamit, Shuvi, Shuvi. The last one we'll do in chapter 53 is on page 529 at the bottom. And this is a teaching that is repeated a number of times in the Tikkunei Zohar. The idea that the expression Yetziat Mitzrayim, coming out of Egypt, is repeated 50 times in the Chumash. 50 times the concept, and I believe that the grammar is a little bit different sometimes. Most of the time it is the exact words Yetziat Mitzrayim, but sometimes it's a variation. But the Tikkunei Zohar points out it's 50 times. So this is very, very significant because, as we know, that between coming out of Egypt to get to receiving the Torah on Sinai is the idea of 50 days. We count 49 days of the Omer, and the 50th day is Shavuos, the giving of the Torah. So the idea of coming out of Egypt 50 times is like counting each day of the Omer is coming out of one level of impurity and replacing it with a level of purity. That's why the Midrash says that we had fallen to the 49th level of impurity. And God just took us out of there because if we would have gone one more level, as it were, we would be unredeemable. Chas v'shalom. So God pulled us out when we reached the 49th level of impurity. So we're told one of the kavanot, one of the intentions of Sfirat HaOmer is every day there should be a mini leaving Egypt, meaning leaving one level of spirituality or impurity or unrectified midot or personality traits and rising to a new level. And that's why also the sages created in the prayer that every morning and evening we would mention coming out of Egypt. And the idea was that coming out of Egypt is not a one-time historical event that happened thousands of years ago. The idea is that conceptually, we need to come out of Egypt every day, because every single day, every person is confronted with obstacles, with challenges, with trials. And every day we have to break through. That's one of the reasons that we read the crossing of the sea, the song of the sea, every morning. Because when we face a new day, inevitably, now this isn't like a negative statement. Every day we are going to confront all kinds of situations that we need to like cross the sea. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just reality. It's reality. I was mentioning to my wife the other day that many times when we go on vacation, for me, the ultimate in vacation is to have 1 or 2 days that have no problems. You don't get an email, you have to do it this. You don't get a phone call that you forgot this. Halfway through the trip, oh, I forgot to bring this. You end up in a mammoth traffic jam when you're trying to get someplace. So for me, I call vacation, if you can get through a whole day and sometimes 2 days without like any challenges, like that's like, wow. But we know that reality is not like that. But it's not, again, it's not necessarily a negative thing. It's just how life unfolds. We have challenges every day. And so our job is to turn challenges into new opportunities. It's not a negative thing. So, Bracha, if you could just wait. Are you okay to wait? Okay. So that's the idea of 50 times coming out of Egypt. Okay, so now 54, which is very, very similar to chapter 53. The first one is on page 534. And this is absolutely one of my favorite Rashis. And that is the first Rashi in the Torah. He asks a rhetorical question. Why does the Torah have to begin with the creation of the world? Isn't the Torah a book of laws, a book of instruction? Why don't we start the Torah with the first mitzvah given to the Jewish people? When we're getting ready to leave Egypt, so the first thing that God says is that this month will be the first of the months for you. Now, we're starting all over again. Coming out of Egypt is a Nisan, it's a new energy. That's what Rashi says. Why doesn't the Torah begin from the first mitzvah? Why do we need the whole creation of the world? So he answers with a verse. And the verse is Koach ma'asav higid la'amo letet lehem nachala bagoyim. The power of his deeds, he told his people, in order to give them an inheritance among the nations. So Rashi continues and says that in the future, now listen, this Rashi is 1,000 years old, but listen how prophetic it is. he said in the future, the nations of the world are going to come to Israel and say, Listimatem, you're thieves. You stole Eretz Yisrael. What gives you the right to Eretz Yisrael? You stole it. And so Rashi says, well, what are we going to answer? And the answer is that's why the Torah has to start with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Because what we will say to the nations are the same God who created heaven and earth, that is who gave us Eretz Yisrael. That is our answer to the nations. And so why am I saying all of this? What does it have to do with numbers? So if you look at the verse that Rashi brings, Koach ma'asav higid lamo, the power of his deeds, he told his people. Now Rashi is bringing this verse to explain why the Torah has to begin with Bereshit, with the creation of the world. Now, if you look at the first verse in the Torah and you count the letters, there are 28 letters in the first verse of the Torah. 28 equals the word koach, power. So when Rashi says, koach ma'asav higid lamo, the power of his deeds, he told his people in order to give them a inheritance in the nations. So this is how Rashi is answering it. That's why the Torah has to begin from Bereshit. So we could say the same God who gave us heaven and earth, he is the one who gave us Eretz Yisrael. But it's hinted to in this word, the power of his deeds, he told his people. What power? What deeds? The power of the deeds of creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I've always found that Rashi just absolutely incredible, especially the prophetic aspect, because even though Baruch Hashem, in the last, I don't know how much we want to say, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, Israel's position in the world has changed dramatically. But nonetheless, there is a good part of the United Nations that still does not recognize Israel. And they say, Listimatem, you stole the land. So Rashi said this 1,000 years ago. It was as if he could see what's happening today. But as we know, especially from the Abraham Accords, different votes that are happening in the United Nations, it used to be Israel, the United States, and I think it was Samoa or some island would vote for Israel, and there'd be like 167 to 3. I can't remember the third. I'm not sure if it's Samoa or one of those islands out there would vote with Israel. So Rashi, it was truly prophetic. Okay, for those who, Micronesia, Avram says it was Micronesia that would always vote with Israel. Actually, Samoa is, I believe, a protectorate of the United States. So I'm not sure they have a separate vote. But Micronesia has a separate vote. And they would always vote. But now things have changed and are going to continue to change. And they will climax with Mashiach coming. Of this, we have no doubt. We believe be'emunah shalema. Okay, I have to mention, for those who came on late, we're not going to have our usual discussion because it is a fast day and it's an early mincha. And as I mentioned, it is also my mother's yurtzeit, so I need to be at mincha in order to be able to say Kaddish and to lead the davening. And all of our learning today should be in merit for Yehudit Bat Dora B'Shaul. My image should have a aliyat in the neshama. So I want to do one more, and this is a little bit, we'll call it like a far out one, but it's just an amazing one. This is from Rav Ginsburg, and that is on page 538 and 539. It's the last one in the chapter. And this is in Parshat Nitzavim. Parshat Nitzavim is one of my favorite parshas. It's one of the shortest. It's one of the shortest parshas in the whole Torah. Every word is like just pregnant with meaning, brimming with profundity. And in Parshat Nitzavim, like much of the book of Devarim, is encapsulated the whole history of the Jewish people. And after going through the whole history is what's called Parshat Tshuva. And in the end, it says, after you've gone through all of these things, you will return to Hashem, and Hashem will return to you, and you'll return to the land, and God will show his love again, and all of these ideas. So there is a certain verse here that reads like this. I'll read it in Hebrew and English. For those who have it, it's on page 536, or it's Devarim 30, verse 6. Devarim 30, verse 6. It says, Umal Hashem Elokecha et levavcha v'et levav zeracha la'ahava et Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha l'man chayecha. And Hashem, your God, will circumcise your heart and the hearts of your offspring, so that you may love God, your God, with all your heart and with all your soul, for the sake of your life. And so, Rav Ginsburg, now, Parshat Nitzavim, we always read the Shabbos before Rosh Hashanah, always. And there are many reasons for that we're not going to get into right now. But Rav Ginsburg points out that this verse has 18 words and 67 letters. So what's the significance of that? So he points out an amazing thing. He says 67 is Gematria Elul. And we're always reading this at the end of Elul in preparation for Rosh Hashanah. And this is called Parshat Tshuva. And what are we trying to do in Elul is to do Tshuva. And so the fact that we always read this during Elul is hinted to that this verse has 67 letters. So Rav Ginsburg says, but what's the significance of 18 words? So he points out that someone very, very important is born on the 18th of Elul. That's the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov is born on the 18th day of Elul. And he says that when you read this passage, he said, this is like the Baal Shem Tov's mission of what he was doing in this world. He was here to like revolutionary, to bring tshuva, to bring Am Yisrael and Hashem closer, to renew the covenant with God. We have to remember when the Baal Shem came on the scene, the Jewish people were so oppressed, were so downtrodden that things look so hopeless. And here the Baal Shem Tov comes, and that's why it ends with Laman Chayecha. The Baal Shem Tov came to bring life. Chayecha is based on the word Chai, the 18th of Elul. That is what the Baal Shem Tov came to renew in Israel. So I remember learning this from Rav Ginsburg, and I remember my mouth just dropping open, like, wow. But when you read it, it's like, oh yeah, of course, this makes perfect sense. So that's how we'll end tonight.